The term deadliest rituals invokes a chilling fascination with the darker aspects of human history, where ceremonies, customs, or traditions often took on a macabre tone, sometimes resulting in catastrophic consequences. While rituals have historically served various purposes, from religious worship to cultural rites of passage, some have garnered infamy for their extreme nature and the loss of life associated with them. 1. Aztec human sacrifice. Among the most notorious examples of ritualistic violence in history is the practice of human sacrifice by the Aztecs. In their religious beliefs, sacrifices were offered to appease the gods and ensure the continuation of the world. Captives, often prisoners of war, were subjected to brutal ceremonies where their hearts were ritually removed while still alive. The scale of these sacrifices was staggering, with thousands of victims sometimes being slaughtered in a single ceremony. 2. Thuggee cult of India. The Thuggee cult operated in India for centuries, engaging in ritualistic murders as offerings to the Hindu goddess Kali. Thugs, as they were called, would strangle unsuspecting travelers with a ceremonial scarf called a rumal as part of their religious duty. Estimates suggest that the Thuggee cult may have been responsible for the deaths of millions of people over several centuries before British authorities finally suppressed them in the 19th century. Make sure to subscribe and press the bell icon. 3. The Cult of Molok. In ancient Canaanite and Carthaginian cultures, the god Moloch was worshipped through the sacrifice of children. Large, hollow statues of Moloch would be heated until they glowed red hot, and infants would be placed in the outstretched arms of the deity, where they would perish in the flames. This barbaric practice was carried out in times of crisis or to seek favor from the deity. 4. Japanese ritual. Seppuku, also known as harakiri, was a ritual suicide practiced by Japanese samurai as a means of preserving honor or avoiding capture. The act involved disembowelment with a ceremonial tanto, knife, often followed by decapitation by a trusted assistant. While seppuku was meant to be a noble and dignified death, it was also an excruciatingly painful and deadly ritual. 5. The Kamakazi Pilots of World War II. In the final years of World War II, the Japanese military deployed kamikaze pilots who carried out suicide attacks by crashing their aircraft into enemy ships. These pilots, often young and fervently patriotic, believed they were performing a sacred duty to their country and emperor. The kamikaze attacks resulted in significant casualties among Allied forces and represented a chilling example of the deadly fusion of militarism and ritual sacrifice. 6. The Hmong Dream Hunt. Among the Hmong people of Southeast Asia, the dream hunt ritual was practiced as a means of communicating with ancestral spirits and seeking their guidance. Participants would ingest a potent hallucinogenic substance derived from the datura plant, believing it would enable them to enter the spirit world. However, the ritual carried significant risks, including accidental death from poisoning or falls during hallucinations. 7. The Cult of Thoth in ancient Egypt. In ancient Egyptian mythology, Thoth was the god of wisdom, magic, and writing. The cult of Thoth engaged in ritualistic practices that sometimes involved human sacrifice, particularly during periods of political upheaval or social unrest. Victims were often ritually slaughtered in elaborate ceremonies as offerings to appease the god and seek his favor. 8. The mass suicide at Masada. In 73-74 CE, during the Jewish-Roman War, the besieged Jewish rebels at the fortress of Masada chose mass suicide rather than surrender to the Roman forces. According to accounts by the Jewish historian Josephus, the defenders of Masada, numbering nearly 1,000, took their own lives rather than face capture and enslavement by the Romans. This act of collective suicide has been romanticized as a symbol of Jewish resistance and defiance throughout history. 9. The Incan Capacocha sacrifice. In ancient Incan society, the Capacocha ritual involved the sacrifice of children to appease the gods and ensure prosperity for the empire. Children selected for sacrifice were often from noble families and were treated with great reverence before being ritually killed, usually by strangulation or a blow to the head. Their bodies were then left at high-altitude sites as offerings to the mountain deities. 10. The Viking blood eagle. The blood eagle was a ritualistic method of execution practiced by the Vikings, particularly against enemies deemed worthy of the most extreme punishment. The victim's back would be cut open and their ribs broken to resemble bloody wings, hence the name blood eagle. This gruesome ritual was intended to invoke fear and demonstrate the strength and brutality of Viking warriors. 11. The Yoruba Osu caste system. Among the Yoruba people of Nigeria, the Osu caste system was a discriminatory social hierarchy that relegated certain individuals and families to a status of untouchability. Those labeled as Osu were considered taboo and were often subjected to ostracism and ritualistic exclusion from society. This system perpetuated systemic violence and discrimination within Yoruba communities for centuries. 12. The South Korean fan death myth. Despite being scientifically debunked, the belief in fan death persists in South Korea, where many people fear that sleeping in a closed room with an electric fan running overnight can lead to suffocation or death. This urban legend has led to the widespread adoption of safety measures and regulations regarding fan usage, despite there being no evidence to support its validity. 13. The Russian roulette ritual. Originating in Russia but gaining infamy worldwide, Russian roulette is a deadly game of chance where participants load a single bullet into a revolver, spin the cylinder, and then take turns pointing the gun at their own head and pulling the trigger. The tension and risk of death make it a chilling example of a ritual that combines elements of danger and fatalism. 15. The Chinese death by 1,000 cuts. Known as lingchi or slow slicing, this gruesome form of execution was practiced in China for centuries as a method of both punishment and public spectacle. The condemned would be subjected to a prolonged process where small pieces of their body were gradually sliced off, leading to a slow and agonizing death. This ritual was intended to serve as a deterrent against crime and rebellion. 16. The Ethiopian bull jumping ceremony. In certain Ethiopian tribes, such as the Hamar people, the bull jumping ceremony is a rite of passage for young men to prove their courage and readiness for adulthood. During the ceremony, the initiate must run naked across the backs of several bulls without falling to demonstrate his strength and bravery. However, the ritual can be perilous, as a misstep could result in trampling or goring by the animals. 17. The Nepalese tradition of Sati. Sati was a now outlawed Hindu funeral custom practiced in Nepal and India, where a widow would immolate herself on her husband's funeral pyre. The belief was that by doing so, the widow would demonstrate her devotion and fidelity to her husband and ensure her place beside him in the afterlife. However, the practice often resulted in coerced or involuntary suicides, with widows facing immense social pressure to comply. 18. The Mai Haka War Dance. While not inherently deadly, the Mai Haka War Dance of New Zealand has historical significance as a ritual performed before battle to intimidate opponents and psych up warriors. The fierce facial expressions, rhythmic chanting, and aggressive gestures were intended to invoke the spirit of ancestors and strike fear into the hearts of enemies, sometimes leading to deadly conflicts. 19. The medieval European witch hunts. During the late Middle Ages and early modern period, Europe was gripped by a frenzy of witch hunts, fueled by superstition, religious fervor, and social unrest. Tens of thousands of people, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft and subjected to horrific trials, torture, and executions. The witch hunts represent a dark chapter in human history marked by mass hysteria, paranoia, and the systematic persecution of marginalized groups. 19. The Tibetan Sky Burial. In Tibetan Buddhist tradition, Sky burial is a funerary ritual where the deceased's body is dissected and offered to vultures as a final act of generosity and compassion. The belief is that by feeding the birds, the soul is liberated from the body and can ascend to the heavens. While not deadly in itself, the ritual can be confronting for outsiders due to its graphic nature and association with death. 20. The Australian Aboriginal Walkabout. The walkabout is a traditional rite of passage practiced by Australian Aboriginal tribes where adolescent boys undergo a period of solitary wandering in the wilderness to connect with their ancestral lands and receive spiritual guidance. While not inherently deadly, the ritual carries risks of exposure, dehydration, and encounters with dangerous wildlife, making it a test of survival and resilience. 21. The ancient Greek practice of hemlock poisoning. Hemlock poisoning was a method of execution in ancient Greece, famously employed against the philosopher Socrates. The condemned would be given a lethal dose of hemlock, a highly toxic plant, which would induce paralysis and respiratory failure, resulting in death. This ritualistic form of capital punishment served as a means of both punishment and philosophical martyrdom. 22. The Mayan ball game sacrifices. In ancient Mayan culture, the Mesoamerican ball game was not only a sport, but also a ritual with religious significance. Losers of the game were often sacrificed to the gods, with their hearts ritually removed as offerings. The stakes were high, as players believed they were playing for their lives, making the ball game a deadly combination of sport and ritualistic sacrifice. 23. The Indigenous Australian Tooth Avulsion Ritual. Some Indigenous Australian tribes practiced a tooth avulsion ritual as part of initiation ceremonies for young men. This painful procedure involved knocking out one or more teeth without the use of anesthesia, using tools like stones or sticks. The ritual was believed to symbolize the transition from boyhood to manhood and demonstrate courage and endurance. 24. The Roman Gladiator Games. While not strictly a ritual in the traditional sense, the gladiator games of ancient Rome were highly ritualized spectacles that often resulted in deadly outcomes. Gladiators, usually slaves or prisoners of war, fought to the death in arenas for the entertainment of the masses. These brutal contests served as a form of public entertainment and political propaganda, glorifying violence and power. 25. The medieval European flagellant movement. During times of plague and famine in medieval Europe, some individuals engaged in a form of ritualistic self-flagellation known as the flagellant movement. Believing that their suffering and penance would appease God and ward off divine wrath, flagellants would whip themselves publicly as a form of religious devotion. However, the movement often exacerbated social tensions and contributed to the spread of disease. These examples offer a glimpse into the darker facets of human civilization, where religious fervor, cultural practices, and societal pressures converged to produce rituals that resulted in untold suffering and loss of life. While many of these practices have faded into history, they serve as sobering reminders of the extremes to which humanity is capable of going in the name of tradition, belief, or duty.